If you live in Mississippi and you own a home, then this video is for you. Imagine this, you go to buy a home and the cost skyrocketed after you bought it. Wouldn't it have been nice to have known that? But that's exactly what happened to me more than a decade ago. And it was flood insurance costs that did it. That's why in this video today, I'm walking you through everything you need to know as a homeowner in Mississippi. So let's get started. Before we do, remember, share, subscribe, and like the channel below. Hi, I'm Chris, flood insurance guru. More than a decade ago, I bought a house in a flood zone just like this right here. Doesn't look like much flood risk, does it? I didn't think so either. But guess what? My cost went up more than 300%. I didn't have much option. I was given the wrong information. The government told me I was in one flood zone when I was in another one. It was a big issue. And that's why I'm shooting this video today, is to help you as a Mississippi homeowner. So whether you're in Columbia, Mississippi, whether you're in Pearl River area, if you're in Biloxi, Gulfport, Tupelo, this video is for you so that you can understand things like flood zones, your flood risks, flood insurance costs, all these things we're going to discuss in this video. So first of all, let's talk about understanding flood zones in Mississippi. Let's start with what's called non-special flood hazard areas in Mississippi. These are areas also referred to as minimum risk, flood zone X. Remember, typically if you have a mortgage and you're in flood zone X, it means flood insurance is not going to be required. Look, that's awesome that your mortgage company is not going to be required. However, Hurricane Katrina showed us in Mississippi, it can flood anywhere. It's important to understand that almost 30% of claims when it comes to flood insurance actually happen in flood zone X. So while your bank's not requiring it, it's still recommended here. Now let's talk about special flood hazard areas. If you have a mortgage, then more than likely you're going to be required to carry flood insurance in these areas. We're talking about areas like flood zone A, AE, V as in Victor if you're on the coast. These are areas that fall within the 100-year flood zone or flood plain. Remember, this is strictly a probability within a given year of it happening. It doesn't mean it's only going to happen every 100 years. In fact, we see 100-year floods happen every day and almost every year now in parts of Mississippi. Remember what happened in Jackson, Mississippi a few years ago? That was more like a 1,000-year event, but you remember what happened. And it happened a couple times. Now, when it comes to understanding things like flood zone A and AE though in Mississippi, one thing you understand is that the majority of the time, flood zone A, even though it's in a 100-year floodplain as well, does not have a base flood elevation. This means that FEMA has not actually determined the flood level. This means changing your flood zone could be a little more difficult. When I changed my flood zone more than a decade ago, I was in what was called flood zone AE. So I had a base flood elevation to compare it to that told me, hey, my house is above this, so I shouldn't be in this required flood zone, which lowered my flood insurance premiums more than $3,000 a year. So when it comes to understanding flood zone A and AE in Mississippi, those are the big differences there. But remember, if you have a mortgage, flood insurance is typically going to be required whether you're in A or AE. Now, V, these are also called coastal flood zones. These are going to be areas right along the water in Mississippi that are exposed to storm surge flooding usually. Now, these are going to be much higher risk. Even though they're still in a 100-year area, they're exposed to a different type of risk. They're exposed to more storm surge, while flood zone A and AE might have more river flooding and may have more lake flooding, flash flooding from riverfall. So you have different flood risk here. So this is how some of the different flood zones work in Mississippi. Well, now that we understand flood zones, let's talk a little bit about flood risks. What is the difference between flood zones and flood risk in Mississippi? Remember, flood zones are usually more from a regulatory standpoint. And what we're talking about here is, hey, did the federal government stating that you're in a high-risk area? Now look, some of these maps are 10 years out of date. Some of these risks could have changed overnight. Like in Tennessee, in Gatlinburg, when you had that wildfire and you had all that runoff go away, or in California, you've had the same thing happen. Same thing in North Carolina after Hurricane Helene, after a flood, where it just took everything out. That's why understanding your flood risk score on your property is different than your flood zone. Look, flood risk are looking at things like distance to water, the type of flooding that may happen in your area. Are you in a floodway? Remember, this is the kind of the overflow area of the flood source, whether it's a creek, a river, or something like that. You have a couple different areas that you can look at. You can go over to riskfactor.com and get your flood risk score there. You can even click in the description of this video on our website and find the flood risk score on your property in Mississippi. It's going to tell you what the actual score is. This is from 0 to 100 chances of your property actually flooding over a 30-year period. It's going to give you estimated premium. It's going to tell you your flood zone. So that's Mississippi flood risk score and Mississippi flood zones. Now let's talk a little bit about flood insurance cost in Mississippi. Here's the big question we get asked a lot, and that is, how much is flood insurance going to cost me in Mississippi? And you know, there's a lot of different factors here. Some of those factors are things like you see behind me: distance to water, flooding frequency, the type of flooding. Is it lake flooding? Is it river flooding? Is it flash flooding? Is it coastal flooding? These things have a big impact. Your elevation, you can see we're elevated pretty high above the water here. That could be a leading factor. And then the replacement cost of your property. This is the actual cost to replace your structure if it was to be destroyed. These all are leading indicators when it comes to cost. Remember, the National Flood Insurance Program does not typically use flood zones any longer when determining their rate, since their Risk Rating 2.0 program came out in 2021. Some private companies do still use that and their costs though, and we'll talk about that in a second when we get to the section on flood insurance options in Mississippi. So what can you expect to pay in Mississippi? Well, I'll tell you on the national average on what we see in Mississippi is typically most people are paying on average throughout the entire state around $1,000 a year. And now that's up to $250,000 in coverage, which is the most the National Flood Insurance Program offers. Now, and understanding cost, I remember the National Flood Insurance Program, as we get into the options in just a second, is going to be the same no matter where you go unless you're taking over somebody else's policy. Now, on cost, this actually could save you a lot of money. It saved me a lot of money. And this is called a policy assumption, where you're basically taking over someone else's National Flood Insurance Program policy that may have a rate that's no longer available. Policy assumptions typically are available on all properties that the federal government insures in the state of Mississippi. So if someone tells you this policy can't be transferable, the only exception we have seen sometimes have been with USAA policies, where you do have to be a USAA qualifier in order to get that. But when we see all the other ones, they should be transferable from one buyer to the next. And it's a pretty easy process where you get a buyer signature, seller signature, probably some bank information, a closing date, and that kind of information. I know, because I did a policy assumption on my own property more than 10 years ago. Now that we've talked about that a little bit, now let's talk about what are your flood insurance options in Mississippi. And let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program first, also through FEMA, the federal flood. Remember, like I said, pricing is going to be the same no matter where you go unless you're taking over someone else's policy. So what coverages are available through the federal program in the state of Mississippi? Well, let's talk about residential properties first. And that is that up to $250,000 on the buildings available, up to $100,000 on your personal contents. If it's a commercial building, you could have up to $500,000 in building coverage, $500,000 in business inventory or business contents coverage here with the National Flood Insurance Program. And you've got deductibles that usually range from $1,000, $250, $10,000. But what we have found though is that changing your deductible with the federal program really has minimum impact. Unlike a Mississippi home insurance policy, where when you increase your deductible from $1,000 to $2,500, you may save several $100s. With flood, we see usually sometimes $25, $50 a year, and that's it. You want to think about that when picking that higher deductible with your flood insurance with the National Flood Insurance Program. So those are the coverages that are available with the National Flood Insurance Program. Now let's talk about private flood insurance in Mississippi. Now, unlike the National Flood Insurance Program, all the private flood insurance companies are going to price it differently. They're going to have different risk factors, availability of the market. Many of them are what's called surplus or non-admitted companies that are going through a company like Lloyd's of London to collect things. Let's talk about building coverage first though. One of the big differences between private flood insurance and the National Flood Insurance Program in Mississippi is private flood insurance can offer coverages more than $250,000. I don't know about you, but it's pretty hard to replace a house for $250,000 in 2024 and beyond. With inflation and building costs and everything else, the good thing is though, you also get more than $100,000 on your personal contents coverage. And you heard us talk about contents coverage with the National Flood Insurance Program. They do not currently offer replacement costs and contents. Many private flood insurance companies do. Private flood insurance companies also offer a third coverage that can be vital, called additional living expenses, temporary living expenses. And let me tell you a story about how you would use this. We had a customer in Nebraska that was devastated by a flood in 2018. All of her neighbors had a federal policy that didn't have additional living expenses. However, she had a private policy that paid for temporary living expense in a hotel for up to 6 months. This took a lot of financial stress off of her and her family and expense. And this is the kind of situation that you would use this type of coverages when your place is not livable, like the people in North Carolina during Hurricane Helene, where they're trying to either rebuild or repair, and it's going to take a long time to do that. But those are the differences between the National Flood Insurance Program and private. Remember, each private company is going to look at things differently. So when trying to pick an insurance agent in Mississippi, you want to pick an insurance agent that's got at least 3 different private flood insurance options so that you can see really what your full options are here. So those are your options. Now let's talk about coverages, and that is how much flood insurance do you need in Mississippi? Having a house in Mississippi, whether you're in Biloxi or Tupelo, you want to have enough coverage there that replaces your property. And this gets into what's called replacement cost versus actual cash value. Replacement cost on your property in Mississippi is going to actually pay to replace it when it's destroyed. Actual cash value is going to take out things like depreciation, and you may see a significant decrease. And I'll tell you a story about a lady in Texas that we had that came to us that had a $150,000 flood policy, but she kept having $20,000 flood claims even though her house was severely damaged. And why was that? Well, one reason was because she had an actual cash value policy instead of replacement cost. So a lot of depreciation was taken out because this house was about 40 years old. So that's the key difference there between replacement cost and actual cash value for your flood insurance in Mississippi. So far in this video, we've talked about flood zones in Mississippi. We talked about flood risk scores, flood insurance costs, your flood insurance options, how much coverage do you need? And now let's go back over to flood zones and let's talk about, is flood insurance going to be mandatory in Mississippi? And a lot of that goes back to what flood zone you're in and if you have a mortgage. Remember, if you're in a special flood hazard area in Mississippi and you have a mortgage, typically flood insurance is going to be required. Or maybe you've taken out disaster assistance from a previous flood. It could be required in this situation, but this is typically when it's required. Now let's talk about, will your Mississippi home insurance policy cover flood damage? In order to understand that in Mississippi, we've got to understand what is defined as a flood in Mississippi. Look, the federal government uses a definition that most private companies use as well, and that is either 2 acres or 2 properties must be inundated with water that would normally dry, and it must be surface water, not groundwater. And by surface water, we mean like a lake, a river, rainfall, something like that. Typically, most Mississippi home insurance policies do not cover flood damage. It's usually an exclusion. You want to look through your policy jacket and read your exclusions when setting up your Mississippi home insurance policy though. Typically in Mississippi, you want to have a home insurance policy and a flood insurance policy because they're going to pay out in different situations. Claims are going to work differently. And we'll talk up deeper in a second about how claims will impact things with your Mississippi flood insurance as well. So when it comes to that flood damage though, that's what's defined as a flood. Insurance companies look at things differently. A home insurance claim may stay on your property for 5 years. However, a flood insurance claim could stay on the life of your property forever. And they're usually reported through FEMA if you have a FEMA policy. Unfortunately, most private companies do not keep a central database, but if your property is ever flooded, it may disqualify you automatically from certain private companies. So that gets us into the section of the video now about how will flood insurance claims impact your Mississippi flood insurance. Like with the National Flood Insurance Program, if you've just had 1 claim in the last 10 years, it's not really going to be that much of an impact at all. However, once you've had at least 2 claims post 2021, there's something called a claims variable the federal government is going to start using. It could have an impact on your renewal rates. If you've had more than 3 claims in a 10-year period, then you fall into the severe repetitive loss list. And this is a special rating that's done through the National Flood Insurance Program Direct program. This means that even the write-your-own companies like Wright Flood, Assurant, Allstate, all these big companies that are kind of third parties for the federal government, they can't even write this type of policy. It has to be done directly through the National Flood Insurance Program Direct program as we shoot this video here in 2024. They have special requirements like mitigation, special pricing, all these different things. Now the good news is these policies are still transferable, so you can still transfer them if you're selling your property. So that's how those can impact you. On the private side, like we mentioned, even if you have 1 claim, could automatically disqualify you for certain private companies. You could be disqualified up to 5 years. It depends on the company. So when deciding to file a flood insurance claim, look, you don't want to file some $500 to $1,000 flood claim if you don't have to. What we tell people is typically you don't really want to file anything less than $10,000 because it could have a bigger impact on your flood insurance premiums long term than maybe a $2,000 or $3,000 claim. So you want to understand that when you're thinking about filing a flood insurance claim in Mississippi. Now we've talked about a lot of different things when it comes to flood insurance in this video when it regards to Mississippi. Let's talk a little bit about picking the right flood insurance in Mississippi and what you need to look for. Look, you want to look for somebody in Mississippi, whether it's in Pearl River, Biloxi, Tupelo, someone that kind of local or at least knows the area locally when it comes to flood risks. They should be able to show you a flood risk score. They should be able to explain to you what the different flood zones are. They should be able to provide national flood insurance program policies, private flood insurance policies for you. They should be able to give you at least an idea of what's going to happen to these premiums in the future. For example, typically the National Flood Insurance Program has statutory rate increases of 18%. Private companies do not. Private company could non-renew your policy while typically the federal government would not. What happens at that non-renewal? Are they going to have more options for you? You want to ask all these questions as you go through the process of picking the right flood insurance agent in Mississippi. Now what about filing a flood insurance claim? How do you go about filing that flood insurance claim? Look, we've got another video you can click up here in the corner that dives deep in understanding the claims process. But briefly, let's just talk about, say you did have flood damage. Typically with the federal program and most private companies, you have up to 60 days to provide proof of loss. This is actually notifying them that, hey, I've got flood damage. You need to get an adjuster out to look at it. Flood insurance claims can be one of the worst claims you ever go through, sadly. It has not really much to do with the agent or the company. It's just typically their catastrophic situations can take much longer to settle. And so you want to remember that as you go through this claims process, you're not going to have it settled in 2 or 3 weeks. In fact, during Hurricane Ian, we saw some federal claims not get settled for 2 years. While on the private side, we were seeing them get settled within sometimes a couple of months, sometimes even less. So you want to think about that too when you're trying to decide between the National Flood Insurance Programs and private flood insurance. So now let's talk about, you've understood how to pick the right flood insurance agent, really how to go about filing that claim, what needs to get in, getting documentation and all of those things because you watched that playlist up there. Now let's talk about a deeper dive into the National Flood Insurance Program or private flood insurance. What's the right choice for you in Mississippi? Look, we talk to homeowners in Mississippi every day here at the Flood Insurance Guru. Oh, private's going to be my best solution here. Look at the price. You want to look at overall, hey, what is private providing? What is the National Flood Insurance providing? Am I getting the right coverages? What does ratings look like over a 3-year period? Pretty consistent. Am I getting a really cheap rate this year only to be non-renewed next year and a skyrocket where they decide to move out of the state like Florida and California and North Carolina are having a lot of problems with right now? Those are some things you want to take a dive at. You want to look at the claims experience with a private company. Look, when you go online and look at reviews, look at positive and negative. And sometimes it can be harder to find the positive ones because many times when it comes to insurance companies, a lot of people aren't leaving positive reviews. So you want to ask around, ask your neighbors, hey, who do you have your flood insurance with? And if it's a private company, you want to dive deeper. And you can kind of look up in the corner of our list here and actually look at some of the top private companies that we did a video on for 2023 and 2024 about top private flood insurance companies like Superior Flood, Neptune Flood. Those are just a few that can be some good choices for you. So that's a deeper dive there in the National Flood Insurance and private flood insurance in Mississippi. Now, I know that this is not going to answer all of your questions for Mississippi flood insurance, but hopefully it helps you get a good start. And I want to say thank you for watching today's video. Now, in the description below, go ahead and download our guide for Mississippi flood insurance. And hopefully that'll help you along your way in trying to figure out how to get flood insurance. And look, if you're ready to get a flood insurance quote in Mississippi, in the description of that video, you can also click on our website and 3 simple steps. You can have that flood insurance proposal in your hands, review it, pick the option that's best for you. I'm Chris, the Flood Insurance Guru, and I want to say thank you for watching today's video on Mississippi flood insurance. Remember, everybody's in a flood zone. It's just a matter of how much water it takes to get to you. Thank you.